Have you ever wondered how things can change suddenly, without warning? Imagine being in your bed, alone, trying to rest after a long day of solitude, and then being surprised by something you could never have imagined. The story I'm about to tell isn't about a simple betrayal. No. It's about something deeper, more impactful, that leaves scars for life. I never thought this would happen to me, but here I am, sharing a story that, I'm sure, will shock you and perhaps even make you reflect on the choices we make. Because sometimes, the unimaginable happens in the most unexpected situations. And when it does, there's no turning back. Beatriz, in the silence of the house, stared at the clock, watching the hours drag by while Carlos, her husband, was once again absent. She knew his job required long hours, but the loneliness was present, like a shadow that followed her around the empty house. When night fell, she felt exhausted, not just physically but emotionally as well. The emptiness expanded around her, and the large bed seemed colder and farther than ever. Sometimes, the absence of Carlos felt heavier than anything else. When exhaustion became unbearable, Beatriz didn't hesitate to lie down and close her eyes. She tried to surrender to sleep, hoping that at least for a few hours, her mind would disconnect from the thoughts that tormented her. However, as soon as she closed her eyes, a strange sensation took over her. It wasn't fear, but something more unsettling. As if someone were there, somewhere inside her own house, waiting to reveal themselves. The silence was broken when she heard the sound of light breathing and a shadow projected against the wall. What followed in that moment was unexpected. Beatriz, unsure whether she was dreaming or awake, felt invaded by the presence that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. She didn't know whether to scream or allow herself to succumb to curiosity about who was there in the darkness of her room. Somehow, the solitude had led her to this point, and in that instant, a new chapter of her life was about to begin, a twist that no one could have predicted, not even her. Gradually, Beatriz began to open up to conversations with Mateus, her nephew. He, who had always been a cheerful and understanding presence, started to become a pillar in the midst of the loneliness Beatriz felt. With every chat, no matter how simple, she felt something inside her warm up. It wasn't the same as Carlos's presence, but at that moment, the emotional support she needed came from him. Through his life stories, Mateus offered a new perspective on what was going on in Beatriz's life. What had started as casual conversations transformed into something deeper. She began to share her feelings, her frustrations with the marriage, and the long hours Carlos spent at work. Mateus, always patient and careful, listened attentively, sharing his own experiences and offering advice that, though simple, touched Beatriz's heart. Each conversation seemed to fill a void that she no longer knew how to handle. Mateus's words, though distant from the passion she desired, began to bring the peace she had been searching for. However, without realizing it, Beatriz found herself becoming increasingly dependent on these moments. They became the most important part of her day, and she eagerly awaited the small chats, the exchange of messages or phone calls. Deep down, she knew these moments were filling something in her life that had been missing, and though she never said it to Mateus, she felt that, somehow, he was the only person who truly understood her at that moment. The connection, although platonic, was already starting to go beyond what she had imagined. As the weeks passed, Beatriz began to notice something different about Mateus. It wasn't something she could define immediately, but the way he looked at her seemed to have changed. There was an intensity in his eyes, a sparkle she hadn't seen before. Every word he said seemed to carry more weight, and suddenly, the conversations that had once been a simple relief from loneliness began to bring a sense of anticipation. Beatrice didn't know what was happening, but something in the atmosphere seemed different. What had once been emotional support was now becoming something denser, more engaging. She began to feel confused about her own feelings. There was a silent attraction, a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. With every message or phone call, she felt a mix of excitement and discomfort. Deep down, Beatrice knew that something was changing, but she still didn't understand what it meant. Mateus's gaze seemed penetrating, as though he was seeing something in her that she didn't even know. That exchange, which had once comforted her, now seemed to bring up a desire she didn't know how to handle. What had started as a simple friendship was now transforming into something more complex, something Beatrice had no control over. What do you do when someone so close begins to stir your emotions in such an intense and unexpected way? Beatrice, torn between reason and desire, found herself on the edge of a decision that could change her life. She didn't know exactly what to do with these growing feelings, but one thing was clear. Her relationship with Mateus was taking an unknown turn. As time passed, what had once been a friendship began to transform into something much more intense. Beatrice could no longer hide the growing tension between her and Mateus. One day, after an especially deep conversation, they found themselves closer than ever. Mateus's gaze, once furtive, was now clear and determined. Beatrice, with her heart racing, felt an irresistible attraction. And it was in that moment, with the soft light of night surrounding them, that their lips met in a passionate kiss. A kiss that seemed to promise more than simple desire. It seemed like a surrender. The intensity of that kiss, the mixture of conflicting emotions, was the turning point. Beatrice felt something new unfolding within her, but also a deep sense of guilt filling her heart. She knew she was breaking one of the biggest pacts of her life. The marriage, the values that had always been important to her, everything seemed to be falling apart. But at the same time, something inside her seemed to awaken, a desire for freedom, to be seen, to be loved in a way she hadn't experienced with Carlos in recent times. The weight of the betrayal was on her, but it felt like a burden she could no longer carry alone. The kiss wasn't just a physical act, but the beginning of something Beatrice wasn't prepared to face. The nights with Mateus became more frequent, and each meeting was charged with palpable tension. The guilt was there, but the need to feel desired and alive seemed stronger. What had started as an exchange of glances and words was now a dangerous game, and Beatrice knew that, at any moment, the consequences of her actions could reveal themselves in a devastating way. She wondered how far this relationship could go without destroying everything she had built. Carlos's discovery wasn't something planned or expected. He, who had always been so focused on his work, suddenly found himself confronted with the truth in a brutal way. What had once been a well-kept secret was now exposed before him, and the impact was immediate. Carlos, with eyes full of pain and anger, confronted Beatrice and Mateus in such an intense manner that, for a moment, Beatrice felt paralyzed. The words he used, the heavy accusation of betrayal, echoed in her mind like a sentence. Her husband, the man she had shared so many years with, was now heading towards something irreversible. Carlos's anger was palpable, his words sharp like knives cutting through the silence between the three of them. Beatrice felt that there was no turning back. The weight of the betrayal, which she had felt in secret, was now being exposed in all its intensity. She saw Carlos, with pain overflowing from his eyes, leave the house, leaving behind the marriage that, until that moment, she had taken for granted. The emptiness she had felt before, caused by Carlos's absence, was now replaced by an overwhelming guilt. She knew that, somehow, what had happened between her and Mateus had destroyed whatever was left of her relationship with her husband. Now, alone with Mateus, Beatriz realized that the consequences of that night would be more than just emotional. What had once seemed like an adventure of desire and pleasure was now becoming a heavy responsibility. They had what they wanted, but the price had been high. The reality of the betrayal fell on Beatriz with overwhelming force, and she found herself facing a new scenario, an uncertain future, marked by the choices she had made and the scars that were forming in that moment. After the storm passed, Beatriz found herself alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. She questioned how she had gotten to that point, where betrayal had taken over her life in such an unexpected way. Regret was a constant in her thoughts, but it wasn't something that made her turn back. Instead, Beatriz began to realize that, despite everything, those experiences had brought important lessons. The emotional scars were visible, but now they were part of her story. She knew that, somehow, the pain she felt would help shape the woman she was becoming. The regret wasn't just because of her husband or Mateus. It was for the loss of herself, the disconnection from her own values. Beatriz realized that the loneliness that had led her to Mateus had much more to do with the absence of connection with herself than with Carlos's absence. She hadn't allowed herself to see what was really happening inside her before the betrayal. It was as if, by becoming physically and emotionally involved with Mateus, she had completely lost herself. Now, with Carlos's pain as an open wound, she understood the price she had paid for being carried away by momentary impulses. Over time, Beatriz began to understand that the real lesson wasn't just in the immediate consequences of the betrayal, but in how she dealt with the long-term consequences. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she would use those lessons to avoid repeating the same mistakes. The healing journey wasn't easy, but Beatriz was beginning to realize that the scars, though painful, were part of her evolution. She carried within her the experience of a mistake, but also the ability to learn from it, and that, to her, was priceless. Now that you've heard the story, tell me, what would you do if you were in Beatriz's shoes? Could the choices we make, often impulsive, really change the course of our lives in an irreversible way? Betrayal, whether in a relationship or any other aspect of life, leaves deep marks, and the question is, are you prepared to deal with the consequences of your actions? Don't be fooled. Every one of our choices, big or small, has an impact. True transformation comes when we understand this. Now, I ask you, what will you do with the knowledge you've gained so far? Don't wait any longer. Make a decision and change your life for the better. And if you want to keep learning and evolving, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Because true change starts with you.